Well, thank you once again for joining us as we come to the end of this series that we're on, calling Coloring Outside the Lines. And so just if you haven't followed everything yet, we do have a few podcasts and YouTube videos just kind of along this line, as well as there's going to be about, I think, 3, if I'm not mistaken, if you go over to our live stream for Connection Church, that will connect and be a part of this series at all. But here we are at the end. This is a series going through the book called The Divine Commodity by Skye Jethani. And we are at the last chapter, chapter 9, Teaching the World to Sing. So, this chapter, the encouragement is really the idea of being humble.
Yeah, so Skye is basically contrasting the idea of personal humility and basically the church's desire, the modern church anyway, desire for a big impact. It seems to be part of our consumeristic culture that we want to make a big impact for God. Yeah,
and I love how he starts with talking about Coca-Cola and it's kind of its rise starting from the end of the 1800s. It's reinvigorations over the years, and to really become probably one of the most, if not maybe even the most recognized brand in the entire world. The idea that the cultural phenomenon that quote is, that it is. There's a quote that comes from the former Coke president, and this would have been in the 80s. And so just the idea of where it is, and again, this is probably 40 years ago when he said this. A billion minutes ago, Christianity appeared. A billion seconds ago, the Beatles changed music forever. A billion Coca-Colas ago was yesterday morning.
That's a big impact.
And he's comparing themselves to Jesus and the Beatles.
Yeah, that's pretty arrogant, actually.
But yeah, those Beatles.
Yeah.
Anyway, Skye highlights how the Coke founder, Asa Chandler, who came up from a Methodist revivalist background, actually used strategies from that very background and what he witnessed being used by old itinerant preachers to get Coke going and moving in advertising.
Yeah, that basically, I think he was considered one of the founders of sort of modern advertising.
That's right. And so Skye writes this. He says the Coca-Cola Company had used messianic zeal in evangelistic strategies to become the most recognized brand on the planet. And by the late 20th century, evangelicals were eager to return the compliment.
Exactly. And so the idea that big impact really has caught the imagination of the modern evangelical movement.
That's right.
The focus has become overwhelmingly about growth in numbers, specifically attendance.
Yeah, I think that's those of you who are maybe not experienced in church, or at least in elements of church leadership, we can attest to this. We've definitely made this mistake. But when you have a conversation with some, different pastors, different leaders, usually it goes to how many people, not what you're doing, even though that does come through there, not where these great growth and transformations, it's just how many people go to your church, and it's about numbers.
And you get sized up pretty quick based on what number you say.
Well, exactly. And then, of course, obviously, the higher the number, the better you look in the eyes of, well, sometimes even ourselves when we deal with our own insecurities.
Sure.
And as well as quite often other people. Mm-hmm. Legitimacy, I think, sometimes is what we say when the number is higher, or what it can feel like.
So basically, success is based on our popularity.
Yeah, it really is. Legitimacy as well. Mm-hmm. And like this was actually from a quote from an advertising expert named James Twitchell. He said, in old time denominations, growth was not a proof of value, but stability was.
Oh, isn't that interesting, right?
Yeah.
So it wasn't necessarily that you were growing, but how long you've been around.
Yeah, and that's about right. And I think just as we say like this, the impact, and again our we'll say our over focus of it. We're not saying growth is bad.
No,
it's the over focus.
Yeah.
And the pedestal to which I think the consumeristic mindset puts it on.
Yeah.
You know,
and that's the important thing to remember, is that we live in a consumeristic culture and we adopt consumeristic values.
Yeah.
And that sort of idea of bigger is better has crept into church as an institution.
That's right. And you know, the numerical growth is what, you know, becomes the high impact, because
Sure.
and the buy-in and becomes the buy-in. And it's not maturity, character building, transformation, you know, by Jesus or joy increase.
Sure.
It really is
All the things
numerical growth.
the Bible talks about.
All the things the Bible talks about. Yeah. And then, you know, Skye just sort of, as he's talking about the different things in the book, like of strategies and different things that were done for high impact. He says, Skye talks about how the focus, you know, tends to be on the crowds that gather to hear Jesus.
Yeah.
But what's forgotten is that his earthly ministry ended with only a handful of followers.
So based on today's standards, by all accounts, Jesus' ministry ended as a failure.
Yeah, in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so I think when the idea of not getting getting caught up in the high impact trap, we have to really see, what does Jesus say and model, you know, through this, because his whole life is modeling and saying about the road of humility. You know, one of the things brought up is, you know, basically in all four Gospels, they talk about what's called the triumphal entry, which is Jesus entering Jerusalem at the beginning of the week, which would, with much fanfare, that would end with him being, in the week he'd be crucified.
Yeah, so that's the day we typically call Palm Sunday.
Palm Sunday, yes.
So that's sort of at the very end of Jesus' ministry, as he's just before he's crucified.
That's right.
And yeah, it's an interesting that in the Gospel of John, I think specifically it talks about the palm branches. They're not mentioned in the other ones. And that's sort of a throwback to 200 years earlier when Judah Maccabee liberated the Jews and liberated the temple from the, I forget who was occupying them at the time. And as a sign of celebration, they waved palm branches.
Yeah, it would have been very much like, their flag, if that kind of recognition.
So the fact that they were doing this when Jesus was coming into town showed the high expectations they had that Jesus was going to liberate them from Roman oppression.
Yeah, and that's why it's such a big deal that, and again, all four of the Gospels, even though John's a little more specific in recalling, at least there would have been a recall to that idea, all four of them make note that Jesus rode in on a donkey, which would have been a symbol of gentleness and humility, and this would have been in contrast to the crowd's expectations. Yeah. And it's, you know, it's really later, even the disciples really, and it was later the disciples really had to recognize that this was foretold by Zechariah.
And the idea of humbleness or small beginnings is also woven through many of other Jesus' teachings and parables.
That's right. I mean, we not that long ago did a sermon series on the parables, and we did talk about, you know, the mustard seed, a very small seed, which grows into the largest of garden trees, and this is relating to the kingdom of God. Also, you know, it's looking at Mark 4:26 and 28, and I'll just read that right now. Sure. He also said, "This is what the kingdom of God is like: a man scattered seed on the ground. Night and day, whether he sleeps or gets up, the seed sprouts and grows, though he does not know how. All by itself the soil produces grain, first the stalk, then the head, then the full kernel in the head." Yeah,
and I think this is an encouragement, as we talked about when we looked at the parable. It's that we as sowers of the seed, or preaching the gospel, or telling others about Jesus, however you want to phrase that, is that we need to be faithful in what we do, throwing the seed. But when it comes to the outcome, that is not really in our control.
Which really flies kind of in the face of this impact idea. Like, try to this big, and it's sort of like, do some stuff for sure. There's a place to play, but it is those important things is really it's not ours.
Yeah, and it's always pitched as kind of like a formula or a manufacturing process. A plus B equals C.
It will always equal that. And if we, and I think we've, unfortunately, in this, we can feel shame. I know I have.
Yeah.
And shame when it's sort of like you've done, if it's not working, it's something you've done something wrong. Yeah. Skye uses Van Gogh's painting of the sower, and we can kind of just show it here as we're talking about it. And really what happens is what dominates the painting is not the sower.
Mm-hmm. Which other painters at the time who influenced Van Gogh, obviously, not obviously, but they focused on the sower. He was a predominant character.
Yeah.
He was the largest character in the painting. How is it different from Van Gogh?
Well, the focus of Van Gogh is, although we do have the sower in there, is the radiant citron yellow sun that saturates the sky with light. And what we know of Van Gogh through his letters that he would write is that he would use the sun and yellow to represent God. And so the dominant thing in this painting is not the humble servant.
Right.
It's the representation of God through the sun and the yellow, ultimately Christ.
Because as you can see in the painting, the sower is fairly small based on the compared to other paintings, and even inside this particular painting.
That's right. There's a lot of focus on that that yellow and that sun saturation.
It's really cool.
So in our consumerist mindset, the temptation can be to control all the outcomes, even to put all, or if not not all, most of the emphasis and focus on the outcome of impact, measured typically by attendance. It can be real estate,
buildings,
and donations,
money. Yep.
But this is not what Jesus models.
No, not at all.
When it comes to big impact, the consumer conscious becomes the focus, and it drives us to look at models that are set by Coca-Cola, like mentioned in there, by Disney.
Sure.
They're taking over the world.
Yep. Starbucks is another big brand.
Starbucks, they're just all these things, and they definitely, a lot of these leaders have written books, and instead of looking to see how Jesus impacted the world, we look at them. And again, I would say there's nothing wrong if you enjoy reading these books. I think there's even things we can glean from reading things that these companies do.
Sure.
But what we can't happen, which the important thing is that we can't let them capture our imaginations and be replaced with what Jesus wants to input in there. And
because I think the outcomes are different.
Very much so.
And Jesus has a different mission, and he stayed true to his mission when he came to earth. His mission was to die in place of humanity so we could have a restored relationship back with God. And he didn't let the temptation of popularity or crowds impact what he was sent to do. And at the end, like you say, there was only a handful of people that were still following him, and even them, they had abandoned him by the very end. So, I think there is a definite contrast today in the church to look at the way business does it and copy those models. And we just, like you say, not that there's not some good things in there, but they don't always line up with the outcome that Jesus is looking for.
Well, and I think when we let those methods capture our imagination, we might end up doing sometimes more damage than good.
Yeah.
And there has to be that realization for us as we look at that.
Yeah, definitely.
And so if we're, kind of going back to the image of the parable of the mustard seed, again, this small seed representation of that, I think that's where we get this. We can go back, a kind of call back to the series title, The Coloring Outside of the Lines.
Yeah. In
a lot of ways, can we color outside the lines of the conventional consumeristic mindset?
Sure.
And so it actually brings us to the end of this whole series and even the book, and leaves us with like the idea of maybe how Skye sort of said, even though he's not necessarily, answering the question of the series title that we picked.
Yeah.
But these are what are ways to color outside the lines of the conventional consumerism mindset that we are plagued with. And I think it's really important that we've got to notice that because we are in a consumeristic culture, we we are in it. Like we can be so formed by those ideals. And so we need to recognize that.
Yeah, we can't be oblivious.
We can't be oblivious. I think that's just it. And then, and then what does that look like? How do we do that? Well, I think there's things that we kind of going back as we go through the videos that we've done and the sermons that were spoken. And, we do things like embrace the wonder through silence.
And that's a very important one, along with not letting our identities be rooted in consuming, but to be rooted in faith and love.
Yeah, and not letting our transformation be out of something external, but internal through the power of prayer.
Mm-hmm. And then there's always the power of being part of a loving, Jesus-following community and to grow in relationships. I think it's very important to be part. Well, we've said this many times, is that Jesus followers are not meant to do it alone. We're meant to do it as part of a community. That's right. And again, a consumeristic community is usually based around an identity based in what you're consuming.
Yeah.
Where this is really based on your love for Jesus and your faith.
That's right. It's taking time to kind of broken down to moments of temporary, prioritized, focused relationship with God. Basically fasting.
Yeah.
And again, I really want to think, I think it'd be scary for people. Skye, and I really like it. He suggests maybe in all culture, fasting media.
Yeah, I really appreciate it when you talked about this in one of the live streams, is that the fasting of media for us is probably in some ways harder than even fasting from what we would normally think of, which is food.
Yeah. And then also that we find our unity in Christ and the cross. Mm-hmm. That's, I think, a really important thing.
Yeah,
and then
lastly, to love strangers and really learn to be friends again, like true friendship and practiced through hospitality. You need to start somewhere, and that's probably a good place to start with hospitality.
Yeah, I think it's a really good place. And I mean, again, we can encourage just going back to the last live stream that would have been last week where you talk about this. I think this is a lost art that we really need to get back to, and
especially post pandemic too. Is that we've been isolated for so long. People are really, I think, hungry to be together, but sometimes we forget how to take a first step. And even if we take a first step, sometimes we stumble and fall, and we don't always pick ourselves up and try again.
Yeah, and I think just even, I think we're increasingly, I feel like, and I mean, I'm absolutely guilty of this, being sort of in the culture of we're always busy.
Yeah.
I think the idea of hospitality is sort of like we need to make sure that this becomes a priority in the schedules, and yes, we're probably busy. That's legitimate. Yeah. I don't want to knock that, but just there's an importance of that. And
I did notice at the end of the book that to sort of combat consumerism in the church, like you said earlier, we need to first recognize that we are consumer Christians and deal with our own consumerism ideals by practicing the things we talked about: silence, love, prayer, friendship, fasting, unity, and hospitality personally first, and then the impact or the change to the church comes.
Yeah.
I think Phil Vischer, from the co-creator of VeggieTales, kind of, and he's quoted in the book, really kind of hammers home this point. He said, I'm growing, this is sort of after VeggieTales had its super high point and was one of the leaders of Christian media or media in general. And then there was a big crash after their
bankruptcy,
movie release and bankruptcy. And Phil, I think, became quite embittered for a bit, wondering what kind of happened. And this is his conclusion after all of that. I am growing increasingly convinced that if everyone with a passion to write a hit Christian song or make that hit Christian movie or start that hit Christian ministry to change the world would instead focus their passion on walking with God on a daily basis, the world would change, because the world learns about God not by watching Christian movies, but by watching Christians.
Yeah. It's a nice little microphone drop for the end of this.
For the end of this podcast, the end of this series. So thanks again for watching, everybody, and we're glad to bring you this type of content, and hope you found it helpful and useful. And we always find it's good to sort of ponder these things and maybe talk it over with a friend. We encourage everybody that's part of our church community to do that, and our missional communities that meet throughout the city in people's homes during the week. And as always, if you like this comment or this content, please like and subscribe to our channel so we can continue to do it. Thanks again for watching.